I was sitting in my college room at St. Stephen's with my then and future Valentine when All India Radio announced in its World News Bulletin that Woodhouse had died. It was a typically sunny February afternoon in Delhi, but we both felt a cloud of impenetrable darkness settling over us. To quote Woodhouse himself, speaking about the passing of his stepdaughter 30 years earlier, and he said, "I thought she was immortal." I had allowed myself to think that Woodhouse was immortal too.
If you lose a great writer of detective stories or a great writer of love stories, there are others to console you. But Woodhouse was just the one. There was nobody remotely like him. And the reason for his international appeal is that he created a wonderland. He created another world. And anybody that can do that is going to appeal to the universal hunger for a never, never world. It's a world in which there's no sex and money is a joke. And it's a world in which language is the king, and everybody has got a sense of anticlimax, and everybody's got the ability to laugh a lot. And every single thing he wrote had a happy ending, and everybody was in love with all his heroines, and everybody wanted to be his hero. So he was a universal and unique figure.
I'm Cynthia Heimel, and I'm a writer. I've written 6 humor books. I came across Woodhouse totally by accident. I was in a bookstore, and I'd heard the name, of course, but he's not on the curriculum for girls who live in suburban Philadelphia. The words just jumped out of the page at me, and I just bought the book, grabbed it, and took it with me everywhere I went. And it was a big book. It gave me biceps.
My name is Benny Green, and I suppose I'm one of millions of avid readers of Woodhouse, and I have been since I was 16. But the first time I realised that he was an international writer was through jazz musicians. When I met American jazz musicians, I was pleasantly surprised to find they wanted to know about Woodhouse. But their interest in Woodhouse had come about in a roundabout way. They played songs that he'd written the words to. Then I realised that he had an American reputation, which was not only different from the English reputation, but possibly even more laudatory than it was in England. It's a worldwide readership, but the humour, you see, is specifically essentially English. It's about an English kind of eccentricity.
I'm Sten Westerberg, and I am president of the Swedish Woodhouse Academy, which I'm proud to say is older than its English counterpart. There was a case of love at first sight, I dare say, or love at first reading, because I got in touch with him as a teenager, and early teens even, sort of browsing the bookshelves of my parents, and so I picked this out and started reading, and immediately this struck a chord within me. I think indeed it was a Code of the Woosters, which is one which deals with Bertie Wooster, the gentleman hero of many of Woodhouse's books, and of course Jeeves, who is his gentleman's gentleman.
I love Jeeves. Jeeves is part of the lexicon. I mean, there are dry cleaners all over America called Jeeves, and everyone thinks he's a butler because they don't understand the servant system. Ballet is something that no one can even conceive of except for me, because I want one, and I want one, a female, just like Jeeves.
I rang the bell. "Sir," said Jeeves, kind of manifesting himself. One of the rummy things about Jeeves is that unless you watch him like a hawk, you very seldom see him come into a room. He's like one of those weird birds in India who dissolve themselves into thin air and nip through space in a sort of disembodied way and assemble the parts again just where they want them.
Bertie Wooster is a very close friend of mine. He lives in a fabulous little bijou apartment where he has everything done for him by his valet Jeeves, including he must wear certain socks. He's a young man forever. He drinks plenty. He flirts plenty. He's always falling in love, but you can rest assured he will never get married because that would ruin books. No one could live with Bertie because Bertie has no brain at all. But he has no brain in the most amusing way you can ever imagine. He has the brain of a small halibut. Jeeves is almost like God, father, mother, uncle, aunt combined. Bertie without Jeeves is a panic-stricken individual. Bertie without Jeeves is a halibut out of water.
Jeeves, of course, is by far the smarter of the two. Actually, it's a fish he eats. As you know, Jeeves is a consummate fish eater, and probably has something to do with that. That is certainly Bertie's theory, at any rate.
I turned to Jeeves, with a pale, set face. Yes, sir. Can you think of a course to pursue? No, sir. Come, Jeeves. It's not like you to be what's the word? Ah, it's on the tip of my tongue. Defeatist, sir? That's right. It's not like you to be a defeatist. Don't give it up. Go and brood in the kitchen. There may be some fish there. Did you notice any when you were there yesterday? Only a tin of anchovy paste, sir. My heart sank a bit. Anchovy paste is a slender reed on which to lean in a major crisis. Still, it was fish within the meaning of the act, and no doubt contained its quota of phosphorus.
Shashi Tharoor, I've written novels and short stories in India, various sorts, including one or two that were overtly tributes to G Wodehouse, whom I first read when I was 11. My first memory of Wodehouse is hearing a passage of one of his novels dictated to me at school in a dictation test by an otherwise totally repellent teacher. But this passage was so hilarious that even as I wrote it down for the purpose of showing my teacher that I could spell, I came up to him and said, where is this from? I've got to read more. And it was from The Indiscretions of Archie by G Wodehouse. And I promptly went out and asked all my father's friends whether they had any books by Wodehouse, and I started collecting one or two that very first week. And between the ages of 11 and 17 or so, I read the entire oeuvre, some 95 books, I think there were altogether.
The butler was standing mountainously beside the tea table, staring in a sort of trance at a plateful of anchovy sandwiches. And it struck the Hon Galahad, not for the first time in the last few days, that he appeared to have something on his mind. A strained, haunted look he seemed to have, as if he had done a murder and was afraid somebody was going to find the body. It was the one butlers always wear when they have allowed themselves to be persuaded against their better judgment into becoming accessories before the fact in the theft of their employers' pigs.
As a child, I thought very much that this was what England was like. It was like Blandings castles with somewhat woolly-headed earls and innumerable amounts of aunts everywhere, butlers, and so forth, and green pastures, and very English. That was very much sort of the landscape it was laid out.
It surprises people sometimes to realize that Wodehouse was actually, throughout my years in India, and I imagine still, the most popular English language writer in the country. In other words, that his readership exceeded that of popular writers of the day, like Agatha Christie or Harold Robbins or whatever. I realize it sounds odd because his erudite butlers, absent-minded earls, and silly-ass aristocrats out to pinch policemen's helmets on boat race nights or perform convoluted acts of petty larceny at the behest of tyrannical aunts don't sound like the kinds of things that would be familiar to and beloved by Indians who come from countries where none of these things seem even remotely possible. And yet they are. I mean, everyone in India, from the English-knowing, educated class in society, knew, read, and loved Woodhouse. His works were stocked in multiple copies in libraries, and we have a great book borrowing culture in India. His works are sold on railway platforms, airport bookstalls, even today, alongside the most successful bestsellers. In fact, in 1988, the Indian Doordarshan television network even did a Hindi adaptation of Leave It to Smith, with the Shropshire castle of the Lord Emsworth becoming the Rajasthani palace of an indolent Maharaja. And the series was a disaster, but I mean, the very fact that people could do this was a testimony to the kind of affection that Wodehouse has held in them. Indians didn't need a visa to this world of the imagination that Wodehouse had created, but they did need a passport, and the passport was the English language, which Indians delighted in. I mean, it's often forgotten that Indians took on the English language, the language of the colonialists, the language of the imperialists, if you like, and converted it into the language of nationalism. So that made it, first of all, only natural that Indians would enjoy a writer who used language as Wodehouse did, playing with its rich storehouse of classical precedents. Wodehouse, in a sense, mockingly subverted the very canons that the colonial educators had taught Indians we were supposed to venerate.
The butler was looking nervous, like Macbeth interviewing Lady Macbeth after one of her visits to the spare room. He groaned slightly and winced, like Prometheus watching one of his vultures dropping in for lunch.
And of course, Woodhouse's style embodied erudition, literate allusion. There's lots of Shakespeare, lots of the Bible, lots of Milton scattered in through the prose, even if it's scattered in by somebody who misremembers it slightly, or Worcester saying, what was that thing, Jeeves, and Jeeves completing the reference. I think eminent critics have suggested that his entire style was a joke about literacy, but it was a particularly literate joke, and I think that explains partially his appeal to Indians. It sort of unveiled us into what I might call a conspiracy of universalism. His humor was inclusive because his mock serious generalizations, his use of language, was as absurd to those he was ostensibly writing about, who didn't exist, as it was to us in India.
He really was a lord of language, and I read him for 50 years now, and I still come across things that he wrote which I don't really believe. He wrote the best description of a drunk that I've ever read. This fellow's had a terrible drink in spring. He's just beginning to come round, and he said he reached desperately for the table as it came round for the second time. I don't know anybody that writes it that could be capable of that. The social standing of the Duke of Dunstable was roughly akin to that of a shark at a bathing resort. And did he propose to you? Yes, but I turned him down like a bedspread. And that kind of language, extraordinary extravagance is all written out in this very matter-of-fact, calm, well-mannered way.
My name is Tanya Ben, and I'm a senior producer with the Russian service. Sometimes, when I read him and I come across an especially funny sentence, and I think, okay, how would it have been in Russian? And I try to translate it, and it's such an uphill, one really would need a congenial translator, somebody who would, I don't know, give all his life to get into this Woodhouse's world and reinvent the language.
He was a man who didn't really have much of a life apart from writing. He didn't do anything else. And that's why there's such an intensity of passion in all the books. He worked very hard at it. I mean, you read his diaries and his letters and you realise what a perfectionist he was. And he writes to his friend William Townend, I've written 40,000 words of the new Blandings novel, but I realise now I've gone the wrong way, so I've got to throw 25,000 words out and start again. Anyone else would have settled for it and gone on, but he was a perfectionist. And if it wasn't working out, he used to chuck it out and start again. Extraordinary dedication.
He doesn't have any preconceptions when he writes. He doesn't have any of the cliches in his mind. He has his own way of looking. It's almost like Matisse. I believe it was Matisse who said, you have to be able to draw beautifully to then play around and do what I do. You have to have complete command of the language, which Wodehouse does, and he's extremely tidy. You will not find one extra word.
Wodehouse had this mastery of the labyrinthine plot, which still astonishes me. And you can boil it down into something fairly simple. There is an object or a person that everyone is looking for. It could be somebody's memoirs, or a cow creamer, or the long lost brother, or the deeds to a house, whatever it is, everyone is looking for it. And he then mixes up the brew so that the people looking for it don't know that all the rest of them are looking for it. And there are people with mistaken identities and assumed identities, and people always one move behind the rest of the plot. And after about halfway through the book, you're breathless. You don't know where you are, which is he's reduced you to a condition of disarray, which is what he wants, so that you just follow him after that, wherever he leads you. And in the end, there's a sort of lovely C major chord, and everything is all, solved again.
Although there are sort of inconsequential. They're very well structured, and they move. So you're always really frightened that Ricky Gilpin isn't going to marry the love of his life, and Hugo is going to have to kill himself because his own true love hates his guts.
He wrote to this friend, William Townend, who went to Dulwich College with him, and he said, I've got this system worked out. He said that if I think of a character in a book, it's no good me giving him 2 lines on page 24 and then killing him. He said, I think of it this way. If we were doing it on the stage and we got an actor to do it, the actor wouldn't accept the job. He's not going to do 2 lines and then walk on. So you have to beef up the part exactly as you do in a musical comedy. You give them a part in the plot, some funny lines, and you integrate them into the thing and make them memorable. He said, you've got to do that, otherwise we can never get actors and actresses to accept the parts.
One way to get exposition out in Wodehouse books is to have to tell Clarence things, because Clarence never remembers anything. So Connie will say, well, you remember, it's your niece Valerie, and she has to be taken away because she's had a bad engagement. And so then we, the reader, gets to, we of course are as in the clouds as Clarence, we don't know. So we get to hear it all through Constance telling Clarence what he really is. And there's no one quite as dreamy and wonderful as Clarence, the Earl of Emsworth. And then, of course, people are stealing pigs. It's always very important in a Wodehouse book about Blandings Castle for people to steal pigs, mainly the Empress.
The boudoir of the Empress was situated in a little meadow, dappled with buttercups and daisies, round 2 sides of which there flowed, in a silver semicircle, the stream which fed the lake. Lord Emsworth, as his custom was, had potted off there directly after breakfast, and now, at 12:30, he was still standing, in company with his pigman, Pirbright, draped bonelessly over the rail of the sty, his mild eyes beaming with the light of a holy devotion. Between the Empress of Blandings and these 2 human beings who ministered to her comfort, there was a sharp contrast in physique. Lord Emsworth was tall and thin and scraggy. Pirbright, tall and thin and scraggier. The Empress, on the other hand, could have passed in a dim light for a captive balloon, fully inflated and about to make its trial trip. The modern craze for slimming had found no votary in her. She liked her meals large and regular, and had never done a reducing exercise in her life. Watching her now, as she tucked into a sort of hash of bran, acorns, potatoes, linseed, and swill, the 9th Earl of Emsworth felt his heart leap up in much the same way as that of the poet Wordsworth used to do when he beheld a rainbow in the sky. What a picture, Pirbright, he said, reverently. We mustn't let her get stolen again.
Most people who read Wodehouse, I did, felt that he made it up, pure moonshine. But he didn't, of course. One example is the Duke of Devonshire, who I read about in Barbara Tuchman's book, The Proud Tower. And he's a model for Emsworth, there is no doubt about it. And I came across her description of Devonshire, and I thought, my God, it's exactly to Emsworth. He used to forget where he was. He used to walk down the corridors of the House of Lords and pass the Prime Minister and not recognise him. He was in his cabinet. And when his brother was assassinated in Ireland, he bought a revolver and hid it at Chatsworth. And then he couldn't remember where he hid it, so he bought another one. And when he died, they found 22 of these revolvers cut over the place. And, of course, the thing that clinches it is he said... in the Lords there was a debate and the subject came up about the greatest pleasure in life, and he said mine is to when my pig won first prize at Skipton Fair, and you realise that Wodehouse is paddling in very familiar waters.
I think I like the way the characters are interwoven in the different books, because again it helps the impression that you are in a special world where everybody knows everybody, where people somehow keep existing in their places and come whenever you need them, so to say. And it's very reassuring to know that you leave a person when you finish a book And then God knows when, God knows where, you are going to meet the same person again. It's like in a real life, coming across an acquaintance 10 years later.
Woodhouse's mission was to make gentle fun of the class of people that he knew. And this class was landowning, public school educated officer class. It was that class that he'd been brought up with and knew very well. And he found them slightly absurd and very funny, and he spent his life poking harmless fun at them. The other class laughed with him because in a sort of way, he was flattering them. I mean, if you're a potty duke and you come across the character of Hemsworth, it makes you feel good, He's making Hemsworth the hero. And the rest of us, the backstreet readers like myself, gloried in it because he was, after all, showing you a decrepit class. But actually, I don't, even as I say that, I didn't think of it in political terms. He was just funny.
Wodehouse is loved by Indians who detest the Raj. And of course, in a curious way, that was all the more possible because Wodehouse had no colonial connection himself. He was one British writer whom Indian nationalists could admire without fear of political incorrectness. I remember, in fact, my mother-in-law was the daughter of a prominent Indian nationalist politician, telling me the story of how she introduced Britain's last Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, in 1947 to the works of Wodehouse. Mountbatten was staying with her father, who was the governor of an Indian state, overnight and wanted something to read at night, and she picked up a Wodehouse and passed it to him. He'd never read Wodehouse before. And it was typical, in a sense, that the symbol of the British Empire had not read Wodehouse, but that the Indian freedom fighter who was the governor of the state had.
Wodehouse was clearly not a revolutionary. You do find the occasional references to actual politics in his day, but it's a very benign world, and there are no really evil people ever appearing in this. I mean, even a Sir Roderick Spode might have his softer sides. Sir Roderick Spode, of course, is someone whom I'm sure that a new reader would be particularly keen to get to know. In a sense, he could be said to be sort of a Woodhousean version of the dictators of the 1930s.
I felt that before proceeding further, I must get the lowdown on this Spode. I don't follow all this man of destiny stuff. How do you mean, his mission? Is he someone special? Don't you ever read the papers? Roderick Spode is the founder and head of the Saviours of Britain, a fascist organisation better known as the Black Shorts. His general idea, if he doesn't get knocked on the head with a bottle in one of the frequent brawls in which he and his followers indulge, is to make himself a dictator. Well, I'm dashed. I thought he was something of that sort. That chin, those eyes, and for the matter of that moustache. By the way, when you say shorts, you mean shirts, of course. No. By the time Spode formed his association, there were no shirts left. He and his adherents wear black shorts. Footer bags, you mean? Yes. How perfectly foul.
He wrote that in 1938, at a time when the English educated classes were practicing appeasement. And Wodehouse was the first one to put anything on the line like that. And nobody gave him the credit for that when the time came to accuse him of treachery. I think that the dust has almost settled, not quite, on the business of the wartime accusations of disloyalty. Just to recap, he was interned when the Germans arrived in the Touquet. And of course, what happened was the American Broadcasting Company, America was not in the war at this time, they were neutrals, came to Berlin and said to them, we'd like to interview Wodehouse. Can we do that? And the Germans decided it'd be good for German propaganda somehow. And so Wodehouse did 6 broadcasts from Berlin to assure the American audiences that he was still alive and kicking. And it was this action which Duff Cooper in the English government castigated and said that it was an act of treachery and Wodehouse was a traitor and when they go, etc., etc. The English thought that the texts of the broadcast were disgraceful, but they never saw them. And when they were eventually published as part of one of the volumes of his letters, you realise that there's nothing in them. There's nothing, certainly nothing pro-German.
A young man, starting out in life, have often asked me, How can I become an internee? Well, there are several methods. My own was to buy a villa in Le Touquet on the coast of France and stay there till the Germans came along. This is probably the best and simplest system. You buy the villa, and the Germans do the rest. The whole thing was very peaceful and orderly. All that happened, as far as I was concerned, was that I was strolling on the lawn with my wife one morning, when she lowered her voice and said, "Don't look now, but there comes the German army." And there they were, a fine body of men, rather prettily dressed in green, carrying machine guns.
It was not an episode which showed anybody up very good light. I think Wodehouse was stupid. In a curious way, he was an innocent man. Innocent, I mean, in the sense of naivety. And I think that the British government at the time was disgraceful. And so, for 50 years, nobody knew what had happened. And Wodehouse was heartbroken. He never came back to England. He went from Paris after the war to New York, and he stayed there. And he was invited back to England as the years went by, and he could never quite bring himself to come because he wasn't sure how he'd be received, and he was genuinely heartbroken. Even at the end, when they gave him the knighthood, he was too old then. A few months later, he died.
You always know when you're reading Wodehouse, you're going to find dotty aunts who are going to boss their nephews around terribly, and you're going to find sleazy characters who are trying to steal pigs or trying to do something horrible to Bertie Wooster. And they never get boring because it's like you're going back to your favorite little Wodehouse universe, the Wodehouse world, and you want to see the aunts. You want them to be horrible, and you want Bertie to weasel out from under them. Because it's Wodehouse world, and you don't have to worry about deadlines, and you don't have to worry about your heating bills. You're back in the land of shrubbery and weirdness.
In Wodehouse's writing, no one ever dies. No one's ever really ill. And there are always happy endings, and it's not a real world. You see, it's a never-never world, and the processes of time are nullified, are ignored. In order to do this, you have to be a certain kind of person, detached from history in a way. And you have to find a way of preserving the world as it was at the point when you decided it was all right. Wodehouse went to Long Island and he boarded himself in his estate, and he's stuck in 1910 for all time. That was the world he remembered at the time when his literary ability flowered. It was the time when the types he wrote about were still floating about and crossing Piccadilly. It was a time when gentlemen's clubs were full of young bounders throwing bread rolls around.
I'm really very grateful to Wodehouse. He almost saved my life. I was very ill, and I couldn't do anything. I was sitting at home. I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't read serious books. Even, the easiest thrillers. Somebody would be dying, and I didn't want to think of that. The only writer who could help me, the only book which I could read easily without coming back to think about my own health and death and things, was Wodehouse. I really think that one needs such writers, and I'm grateful that he does exist.